Welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be on right now. It's been a couple of weeks of excitement getting prepared, and I've done a lot of things in my life, but this has got to be close to the top.
Thank you, and Reader's Magnet, and thank you, John, for putting this forth and taking the chance on us authors in presenting this out to the world.
I've enjoyed this immensely, Joanne.
Ellie, so have I. Thank you for who you are, and thank you, Reader's Magnet. You all are beautiful, and you've worked so very hard, and we are blessed.
We are.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers. We thank Reader's Magnet and everybody that's involved. I love Reader's Magnet. They say, we share your stories with the world.
Hi, welcome to my virtual booth here at the Festival of Storytellers, Reader's Magnet special event, and I'm pleased and proud and grateful to be here. Today, I'm going to talk about the 6 novels that I brought to the festival, but I'm only going to focus on one, so don't get too nervous about trying to spend all that time that it would take to go in depth on all of these. But I'm going to introduce each of them briefly and then get into today's main topic. First of all, I want to talk about Bonita. I'm going to be working with her more at my booth presentation tomorrow. But Bonita is one of my favorite characters in all of literature. Now that's saying a lot, you know. I mean, there's Tolstoy and there's a whole bunch of other really wonderful characters, but I sort of like Bonita, and she's so adventurous, so audacious, and so intelligent that I don't think anybody will find it easy to put the book down once they pick it up. There's a sequel to Bonita, to the original book, because things don't get totally wrapped up and tied up in a little bow in the first book. So she's been searching for her daughter, and she finds her, and somebody else has the daughter, and she doesn't want them to have her daughter. She wants her daughter back. So that's the source of the title for You Can't Keep Her. So those are 2. And then I have a trilogy, actually. This is, I call it the Maxwell Trilogy, the saga of the Maxwell family of Northern California. The Maxwell Vendetta is the first one. This is the story of Andy Maxwell and his whole family, who are being pursued and persecuted by a villain who wants to wipe out their whole family. And sorry, I've got people on camera I didn't particularly plan on. So anyway, trying to save his family from being persecuted, and he thinks he's done the job. He gets rid of the real bad guy and sends him off to the Orient, or he'll never get back. Except, of course, he does. So he comes back for the second vendetta, and that is, of course, the next one in the trilogy, the middle one in the trilogy, and both of these are quite available on Amazon. And finally, we have Swindle in Sawtooth Valley. Sawtooth Valley is where Andy's family live. It's a wonderful little town up in the High Sierra, a great ranch, and so on and so forth. All of this other stuff has been taking place right in that locale. But even though it seems like there's going to be peace in this valley, it turns out not from the villain we saw before, but a new group. We got a rich and powerful family. So obviously, or inevitably, people are going to want what they have. And that's how they do it this time, is by trying to swindle the family out of their holdings. And that is going to come out next month. And so that's the cover and the two of the main people involved, main characters involved in the whole story. And finally, today's main attraction is called The Yellow Rose. My other novels are set in this area between the High Sierra and San Francisco. And the High Sierra and San Francisco. But I leave the Golden State for The Yellow Rose. It takes place in Texas. And there is an interesting story behind how this whole book came to be. I was contacted by a gentleman that I knew from corresponding online, and also having met him at a couple of writers' conferences. And so Bob Stewart said to me, he said, I would like to do a book about this woman, the Yellow Rose. And I said, what? You mean the Yellow Rose? All I know about the Yellow Rose is that it was a song by Mitch Miller way back when. And he said, no, not that. It's about a woman who was involved in the Texas Revolution, and she and Sam Houston were largely responsible for how it happened. But I said, Bob, I'm not only a Californian, but I don't know very much about Texas. I knew that the Texas Revolution happened, that the Alamo was somehow involved, but beyond that, are you sure you're talking to the right guy? And he says, oh yeah, I've read your stuff, so I think you're the guy that can really make this come alive. So he talked me into it, and it was great. The experience of doing the research, finding out all this stuff about Texas, and all the stuff that went into the Texas Revolution. Texas, I found out, was a nation before it was a state. It was turned into the 28th state, but before that, in 1836, they won their freedom from Mexico, and they turned themselves into the nation of Texas, and they were independent, and Sam Houston was the president, just like any other country. And it wasn't until, another dozen years later that we finally were able to, or that they were finally able to bring Texas into the Union. And that is kind of a little bit of the history. There's more background, though, and it's background that I didn't know, and I imagine there are a lot of people who don't know about the fact that a yellow rose, in the parlance of the time, referred to a good-looking mulatto woman who was pretty as a rose and who was also light-skinned. You've heard the term probably high yellow. Well, that's the kind of person she was. That's her place in society. She was a free Black woman. She was not a slave. She was a worker. She was from New York, not Texas, and she was hired on by a gentleman named Henry Morgan, who was trying to set up a resort down in Galveston, and he hired her on to come down and work both in his warehouse and to serve in the dining room of his hotel, dining room / bar of his hotel. And so she signed on for a year and came on down. And so she, as it turns out, was there at the same time as Sam Houston, at the same time as the revolution was going on. Now, this is where the whole idea of writing historical fiction kind of branches off from reality, because sure, you have to pay attention to historical facts. Sam Houston was a real person. He had a background. He had all kinds of verifiable experiences. So it was good to be able to follow Sam Houston around. But the Yellow Rose, her name was Emily West. It could have been Emily Morgan. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people who believe her name was Emily Morgan, and it makes more sense that she was tagged with that last name because the gentleman who employed her, his last name was Morgan, and it was common for Black people to be slaves in those days and to take on the last name of the master. But there's still a lot of Emily Morgan paraphernalia and belief in legends in Texas. There's actually an Emily Morgan hotel in downtown San Antonio. So that's who we had. That's about all the knowledge we had. So we were free, as Bob Stewart, my co-author, said, we were free to just ask the question, what if? And the what if that followed, well, what if Emily West and Sam Houston fell in love? Well, we don't have any information that they actually met, but we didn't have any information that they didn't. So that kind of left us free to go ahead and say, hey, if they had a relationship and they got involved somehow in the revolution together, what would have happened? What would that have been like? So we went ahead and divided things up. I wrote the chapters that were from Emily's point of view, and Bob wrote those that were from Sam Houston's point of view, and away we went. I mentioned a little bit about my background, but just before we let the book speak for itself, I wanted to tell you that I am, as I said, a native Californian. I am not only a native Californian on my own, but my great-grandparents came across the plains in 1864, and they settled in a little valley north of what became known as the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I live still, or again. And we, but the family, we meaning the whole family, have stayed around here for these many years. I've never really wanted to live anywhere else. I like to travel. I've been to a lot of places, but as far as settling down and putting down roots, this is it. And I'm right here in Northern California, where I have located or set most of my books. And so what I would like to do is kind of take you through our novel, as well as to tell you the story of the Texas Revolution, because it's a really interesting event. I found it fascinating to research it, as I said, and I think that what I discovered in my research, you'll discover a lot of in this novel, and you'll be very, very glad that you went ahead and took a look. So we open in Morgan's Point, Texas, February 24th, 1836. Girl, let's have another. Sam Houston called to me, waving his mug at the end of a buckskin-clad arm. Fringe danced under an armpit, stained with sweat. It probably smelled worse than a dead polecat, but sure as cotton's white, I wasn't about to test that theory. My name is Emily West, but in Morgan's Point Hotel, they call me Girl. A common enough name for a mulatto woman working in a saloon. Somehow my skin didn't crawl when Sam Houston said it, though. He didn't use the derogatory tone most of these louts did with us darker people. I could slough off the insults better than most, being a high yellow mix of white and black, a free woman under contract, not the slave that people figure me for. Still in all, that constant boy, girl, boy, girl business felt like needles jabbing, jabbing, jabbing every time. Houston, though, he sounded like he was just calling for service. That's what got me interested in the first place. I nodded in his direction and made my way toward him, dodging and slapping away the customary pats and squeezes, some on my backside, some higher, some lower. The clients of Morgan's Point Hotel Saloon were rougher than an outhouse corncob. That's what I like, he said. A woman who steps right to it when a man calls. Houston said to his companion without taking his eyes off me, "And what say, General?" demanded the man sitting across the table from him. "Turn your good ear so you can hear me, Deef," Houston said. Then, playing to the rest of the table, he yelled, "Oh, I forgot. Deef ain't got a good ear." The men roared their delight, Deef right along with them. Houston handed over his empty tankard, then picked up his jackknife and began whittling on a shapeless wooden block. The slivers joined the other shavings that covered his moccasins. He wasn't much to look at, this Sam Houston. Nose a bit too long, lips too thin, his hairline headed north, and bushy sideburns curving south along his chin. Kind of disappointing, since I'd heard so much about what a warrior he was, wounded hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Gossip here was that President Andrew Jackson had sent this big drunk to pull his God-forsaken Mexican hotbox into the Union. Why they want it at all was beyond me. Didn't seem worth the wind it would take to blow every grain of sand into Galveston Bay, which seemed likely to happen any day. Houston just wanted to prove he could do it, was my guess. Like any man. Seems like what made the most sense was just leave it to the Mexicans. But nobody asked me. Houston and his buddies were on their way to getting glassy-eyed, but hadn't quite arrived there yet. I got Houston's attention by making sure he got a peek inside my low-necked bodice when I bent over to pick up his mug. Then I turned around, gave my hips an extra little swirl, and tossed a smile and a wink back over my shoulder as I returned to the bar. I felt his lust. Good, I thought. That means bigger tips and bigger savings toward the inn Mother and I planned to buy when I got back to New York, where I belonged. Still in all, he didn't look like someone you'd count on to turn a mismatched conglomeration of Anglos and Mexicans into an army fit to throw off the likes of General Santa Anna. Quite a gamble for old Hickory to back him, like betting on a long shot in a cockfight. But maybe the president did that too. Houston's watery blue eyes scanned me. He tilted his head like a dog, curious and wary about a cat he's happened on. He swayed a bit, not unusual for our patrons that time of night, but sure noticeable with his height. Well, you're a tall one, he said. Is that what makes you a great leader? I said. Your knack for spotting what's obvious? Here, girl, keep your mouth to yourself. A monotone voice flared behind me. A rough hand grasped a fistful of my sleeve and pulled at me. I was about to treat his hand to a taste of my fingernails when Houston laughed and said, No, don't, Deep. Leave her be. She's got gumption, and you know I like a good laugh. He reached to dislodge his buddy's hand, but never took his eyes off me the whole time. Nor did I take mine off his. I felt Deep release his grip and retreat. Big dog, little dog, I'd seen that act before. He hears better than he makes out, doesn't he? I said. You don't talk like a Southern nigger, Houston said. No, sir, I said, mimicking the accent of a Southern chattel. I was from New York. Well, then why are you here? Colonel Morgan signed me up to look out for his warehouse and serve here in his saloon. Signed you on? Contract then? 1 year, and with 6 months to go, I wish it was over. So, you're one of those free ones, are you? Cross my heart. I batted my eyelashes and patted the place under my blouse where I had my papers tucked away. Lots of us around, more than you might want to think. Warehouse. Big job for a man like Jim Morgan to trust to a girl, free or not. So you must be able to read, write, and cipher. Me, I said, simpering and looking up at him with half-closed eyes, a simple bar girl. Houston smiled. Deep, he said, sitting back down and grasping the handle of his mug. We must treat this woman with respect. She's probably more educated than you or me. Well, that's a safe bet, I said. He stuck out his hand. Houston's the name. Sam Houston. I didn't take his hand immediately. I don't have to read, write, or cipher to know who you are, General. He didn't withdraw his hand. It's Sam to you, miss. He raised his eyebrows. I finally deigned to clasp his hand. West. Emily, General Houston. Well, Emily West, would you draw me a bath and see to my buckskins? He lifted a pair of saddlebags from the floor and slapped them on the table. I have another outfit in here, needs washing as well. I'll dry your bath, General, I said. Then I whispered, and that's all. What did you say, girl? Deep said. Houston shrugged. Deep here didn't catch that, but I heard you loud and clear. Deep started to answer, but sat looking at me with murder in his eyes. Obviously, no one challenged his general. Houston downed his beer, then leaped up and marched off toward the stairs that led to the upstairs rooms. I gathered the saddlebags and followed, Deep struggling behind me. My mind was racing. I thought I'd had control of the situation with this overgrown, half-drunk, so-called general, and then suddenly I was left holding his dusty saddlebags and chasing him up the stairs. My first lesson on how quickly Sam Houston could turn the tables. Well, Emily follows him up to his room with his dirty laundry, and they go on in. I passed over the general's threshold and closed his door behind me. He stood by the copper tub with his back to me in the process of disrobing. He said without turning, once you've pulled out those filthy duds, just toss the saddlebags on the bed. I did what he asked. Commanded would be a better word. Under the dirty clothes, I noticed a plump bag of what looked like coins. Was he trusting, forgetful, or testing me? Whatever the case, I knew I had to let it be. I stepped back toward the fireplace where a pot filled with water hung heating up over the flames. This was the most luxurious room in Colonel Morgan's hotel, the Brazos Suite. In New York, they'd have laughed the week away at the idea of calling a single room a suite, but this had its own fireplace, which put it at the top of the frontier heap. If Deaf Smith was an example, if Deaf Smith, for example, wanted to get clean, a big if, he'd have to go down the street to the common bathhouse and plunk himself into a tub in the presence of a half dozen other filthy creatures. I almost remarked it was a strange way to show me the respect he talked about downstairs, to bear himself like I was a common whore, but I heard my mother's cautioning voice in my head, and I bit my tongue. I may have been a free woman, but I was still a servant and a long ways from home. Just February to October till my year was up and I'd get my pay and my passage east, and this outpost nightmare would be over. Right now, though, the only difference between me and a slave was that my servitude had a time limit. I couldn't afford to incur Colonel Morgan's disfavor. We needed that money. I wouldn't be safe till I was back with my mother in Colonel Morgan's Hudson River summer house, the place he pledged to sell to us so we could start our business. What Morgan was paying me, combined with my mother's sewing and egg money and my tips, would be enough to get us out of service and into the innkeeping business. We dreamt about that business for years. But even with all that on my mind, I couldn't quite leave things be with Houston. I slid back into my slave dialect. I was coming directly with your bath water, General, sir. He just sat there, humming and drumming his dirty fingers on the side of the tub. Soon the humming stopped, his eyes closed, and he appeared to drift off. I won't say he passed out, though that might be nearer to the truth. I picked up the hooked rod, tipped the steaming pot, and filled the bucket that had been waiting on the hearth. Here it comes, General, I said as I approached the tub. Fair warning, it's a little warm. Houston's eyelids flew open, but he didn't respond otherwise. I smiled to myself as I lifted the bucket. Normally, I'd ask the gentleman to cover himself, then pour the first bucket slowly from the foot of the tub to give him time to get used to the temperature. However, Houston had already proved disinclined toward modesty, and so I marched right to the center of the tub, and then I stopped. An ugly wound drained pus out of his right shoulder. Did you get hurt fighting with Indians or against them? It was none of my affair, but everyone knew he'd spent some time with the Cherokees in Carolina or Tennessee or some such place. Maybe he even had a wife or two there. Some said he was trying to get some local chief named Bull, a name so comical for an Indian chief, I figured it was made up. He wanted Bull to side with him against the Mexicans. one way or the other, I suppose. So he wanted me to shut up about it. Well, nothing's more sure to make me keep a conversation going than to be told to shut up. When? Well, about, I don't know how long ago, some Indian war leading up to New Orleans, and then again in that battle, I felt a budding compassion for the man. That was nearly 24 years ago. It sure looked like a fresh wound that needed tending, but not one that was years old. Was he lying? I couldn't think of a reason why he would. Would you like me to look after it for you? Girl, I've been tending it myself for years. He sounded as if my kindness not only counted for nothing, but even annoyed him. That infuriated me. I'd stopped that smart mouth lying. I aimed at a spot some inches below his belly button and dumped the whole bucket in one hot waterfall. I was gratified to see his lobster turn pink and jump out of its nest. How's the temperature, General? I tried to keep my tone businesslike, but I was inwardly giggling that I'd revenged myself for his earlier insolence and his current lie. His little soldier would be tender for a while, but give him credit. Most men would have jumped up in a rage, but Houston didn't flinch. Perfect, girl, he said. Keep it coming. This time, the way he said girl carried the same insulting tone the rest of the men used. So what had started out as a friendly relationship had become hostile. So that's the way this affair begins. Of course, it doesn't stay that way through the whole book, but it's a very interesting process seeing how we get from there to what eventually happens. In the meantime, of course, Emily has to keep track of her money and try to make sure that she gets back to New York in solid shape. And here's the letter she writes to her mother, sort of to keep, make a progress report. It will be hard to credit, Mother, but it's the full truth that your housekeeper daughter made the acquaintance of a real general. His name is Sam Houston. You probably already know about the splash he made in 1812, and I believe you and the rest of the world may be hearing a thing or two more about him in the coming days. Other than that, my life here continues much as before, and I count the days till I can leave Texas and wend my way back home. I'm sure we'll have enough money to open that inn we dreamt of. Hope your rheumatism is better. Be sure to keep smiling, because it's the memory of that smile that sustains me throughout the long days and the hard work. So that's Emily's touch with home. Now, in the course of things, of course, that's well said. Houston gathers up an army and sets off to conquer Santa Anna and free Texas from the Mexicans and start a whole new nation, or at least a state in the Union. And during as that whole thing proceeds, it doesn't go very well. And at this point, his army, which is pretty ragtag, is undisciplined and unfocused, and they are on their way to see what they can do in San Antonio. And on their way, there are two women who come talking to him. They know Santa Anna has besieged the Alamo. The Alamo, which was a church. Excuse me. Was a church as it became a fort, but that's where the Texicans, as they were called, holed up, trying to see what they could do about Santa Ana. But as the Texicans and Sam Houston are headed west toward San Antonio, they are found by two women. And these ladies say they can't talk about this anymore, so it's up to me to speak. I'll put it as plain as I can. He started, but his voice ceased, struggling with the moment. He finally gained control. The Alamo, he said, has fallen. Of course, there was an uproar and a volley of curses and cries to go after Santa Ana and get revenge, but that was nothing compared to what happened after Houston's next bombshell. Santa Ana slaughtered every single one of our brave patriots. He gave no quarter. He took no prisoners. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then cries for vengeance erupted from hundreds of throats. Sam held up his hand once more. Mrs. Dickinson and Mrs. Tolliver have been through a great trial. They were captured by the Mexicans, then released as witnesses to what happened. Mrs. Dickinson was actually shot, nipped in the leg as she left the Alamo with her child in her arms. It was only Providence that led Deep Smith and Mr. Hardy to them in time to bring them here to safety. Another uproar. Houston held up his hand, but the men were angry and frustrated. The women freely let their grief escape in sobs and wails. Houston again insisted on quiet. We're all that's left, us and Colonel Fannin and his brave men down in Goliad. The Mexicans will surely come after us and them both. We've got to stand proud and strong. We'll regroup right away and get ourselves ready to handle those devils. Well, what happens is that they don't regroup and make a stand. They begin a retreat. A strategic retreat, Sam called it. There was an awful lot of rancor and controversy about the fact that he wasn't going to just stand and fight, but he said, "We're not ready to fight. We're going to make it a time and place of our own choosing, and I have a plan." Well, what is your plan? Well, you'll find out whenever it happens. So they headed back east, the direction they had just come. And Santa Ana and his army were in hot pursuit. And finally, in the course of not finally, but in the course of everything, of course, the relationship between Sam and Emily grows. In the General's Tents, the name of this chapter, Sam indicated Emily should take a camp stool, and he pulled up another one facing her knee to knee. He reached across to take her hand. It was calloused, yet amazingly soft for a woman who'd spent her life in manual labor. A sturdy hand that drove a wagon team, washed clothes, chopped wood, hoed a garden, and kept meticulous books. A soft but calloused hand. Another of those inconsistencies that wrapped her in a conundrum. Like her heritage, not black, not white, but high yeller, neither one nor the other, but both. Joe said, "Jim Boyd died in his sickbed surrounded by dead Mexican soldiers," she said, softly tugging to retrieve her hand. Sam held on to it like an anchor. He said they were stacked up like cordwood around him. One even lay on top of him, gutted like a sacrificial bull. "Did Joe bring the knife?" She shook her head. "No, I asked him, but he didn't see it." Some lowlife is flashing it around, bragging about taking it from Jim Boy. Thoughts of such a savage, unjust death crawled through his spine like maggots. Your best vengeance will lead to Texans to victory and establish that great free nation you're always talking about. God willing, he said. He dropped her hand, withdrawing from her into his own thoughts, making battle plans as he always was. You never talk much about God, Sam, except to your speeches. How are you and he getting along? Well, Emily had done it again, pulled him back into connection with her by talking about the Almighty in such a down-to-earth way, as if she were asking about his relationship with an old friend. I guess I'm not sure, Emily. He took her hand again. This time she didn't resist. He looked in her eyes. Maybe it's because I don't pray enough or something. I mean, I've always recognized a higher being. Hell, I even got baptized Catholic just so I could become a Texican. But that slaughter in San Antonio, so many good men dead, makes me wonder just whose side is he on. He'll always be on your side, General Houston. You've been talking to him, have you? I don't have to talk to him to know your side is righteous, my general. General Houston has a name for Emily. He calls her Sweetness. Sweetness, Sam was thinking, had more unadulterated gall than any man in either army, even Erastus. She stood on her toes, ready to flee if necessary, but still held her ground. She just snatched up the last jug of moonshine Deef had brought from Goliad and was holding tight to it. He felt the boiling blood of rage rush to his head. What are you doing, girl? And he realized he'd said girl in the same tone he'd heard sounded in the tavern, words as sharp as a tavern dart, and his drunkenness would be no excuse. But he didn't feel like apologizing. As long as she held that jug away from him, he was mad, a matter of honor as much as anything else. I'm saving you, she said. Tears drained down her cheeks as she swallowed hard, shoving the words through tightly clamped lips, her teeth pushing down on their top lip. She paused. And I'm saving Texas. I don't need saving, and how in tarnation would you save Texas? I'm going to save both your futures tonight. She lifted the jug high and threw it to the tent's earthen floor. It hit a rock and the crockery shattered, and long arms of liquid splashed into Sam's moccasins and the edge of Emily's dress. Damn, girl, these moccasins were made for me by Chief Bowles' granddaughter. You told me enough times. That stunned him. Always she had earned her nickname. Now Sweetness didn't fit. Nag would be more appropriate. That was the last of the jugs that Erastus brought back from Goliad. And I'm going to skip over a little bit of the of what happens because there is a legend, and I'm not going to go into it here, that the way the Texicans won the Battle of San Jacinto, which was the deciding battle in that whole skirmish, was that Emily went over to the Santa Anna's tent and, quote, distracted him, took his attention away from the battle and made it possible for the Texicans to come in and defeat the whole Mexican army and Santa Anna's people. And this was the going into battle speech that Houston says. Today is the day. I know you've been frustrated, no more than I have, but I told you we'd meet the enemy when the time was right, and that time is now. Huzzah, a voice said, and Sam immediately threw up a warning hand. Today is our day. We will fight and we will win, but only if we remain silent until we attack. Become like the Indians stalking game. Then, when an attack comes, you can become Texicans again, fierce and merciless. He knew a cheer was coming, so he threw up his hand again, and the cheer died in 1,000 throats. Sam looked at Erastus, who shook his head and grinned. Some have thought me a coward, that I was running from the pepper bellies, but to fight when defeat is sure is not courage, but idiocy. We had to wait for our day, and today is our day. We had to retreat and drill until we were ready. Today we are ready. Today we have Santa Anna in a trap, surrounded on 3 sides by water. Deep has burned Vincent's Bridge. Their only way out will be going straight toward us. And today we are ready. They can't escape. So, of course, the rest is history, as they say, and that was one place where we can't deviate from history. They won the Battle of San Jacinto and became the Texas Republic. So that's the 6th of the 6 books that I brought here to the festival. Just as a little reminder, I wanted to make sure that you remembered that we have the Maxwell Vendetta on one side, the second Vendetta on the other, and they are part of a trilogy that includes Swindled in Sawtooth Valley. Great reading entertainment and available in your local online. And finally, let's not forget Bonita, the beautiful, smart, and intelligent and exciting Bonita, who takes the frontier, California frontier, by storm all the way through incredible events like the Mexican-American War and the Gold Rush, and California's ushering into statehood to become the 31st state in the Union. So that concludes my presentation. I hope you've not only enjoyed it, but learned a little bit of history that you maybe will be very glad to know. And I bid you farewell.